During the Gilded Age, in the early years of federal corporate regulation, moments when public access to detailed population data could have dramatically shaped political discourse. And then there's the final, haunting detail. The only surviving fragments of the 1890 census weren't preserved by government archivists. They were saved by accident. A handful of damaged pages had been temporarily loaned to state agencies before the fire. Those few scattered records, just tiny fragments, are all that remain of what was once the most comprehensive demographic snapshot in American history. Millions of lives reduced to ashes. And officially explained away as a series of unfortunate accidents. But when historians map the patterns, examine the timelines, and compare what was lost to what was preserved, a far more unsettling possibility begins to emerge, because sometimes history isn't erased in a single dramatic act. Sometimes it disappears slowly, quietly, under perfectly reasonable explanations, until one day, an entire chapter of a nation's story is simply gone, and no one can prove what it once revealed. And when a chapter disappears, something else happens that most people never notice. The story that replaces it becomes easier to control, because without records, there is no way to challenge official narratives. There is no way to verify claims, no way to trace patterns, no way to see what changed and who benefited from those changes. This is exactly what historians began realizing in the decades after the 1890 census vanished. They kept encountering strange statistical jumps in American history. Sudden increases in urban populations that couldn't be fully explained. Abrupt shifts in labor force composition. Entire regions where wealth appeared to concentrate almost overnight. But without the missing census data, there was no way to confirm whether those changes were gradual or artificially accelerated. It was like trying to measure the speed of a train when the most critical section of track had been removed. One economic historian described it in unsettling terms. He said, "The destruction of the 1890 census didn't just erase information, it erased accountability. Because census data is unique among government records. Unlike tax documents, which can be manipulated, unlike corporate reports, which can be influenced. Unlike political speeches, which are designed to persuade, census records are raw. They capture reality at a single moment in time, before narratives can reshape it, show who owned property, who had nothing. Who moved, who disappeared, who suddenly became wealthy, and who didn't. In other words, census records are one of the most powerful tools for understanding how power shifts in a society. And that's why their disappearance creates something historians call a statistical blind zone, a period where we know events occurred: industrial expansion, massive immigration waves, labor unrest, but we can't fully measure their true human impact. This blind zone doesn't just affect genealogists searching for ancestors, that affects entire fields of research. Economic historians can't precisely track wealth distribution changes between 1880 and 1900. Sociologists can't accurately measure how quickly urban overcrowding developed. Public health researchers can't fully map disease patterns during that era. Even civil rights scholars struggled to quantify demographic shifts in minority communities. During the late 19th century, it's like a crucial lens was removed from history, and once you see that pattern, something else becomes harder to ignore. The destruction of census data didn't stop in the early 1900s. It simply became more subtle. Throughout the 20th century, multiple federal policies allowed for the routine disposal of certain census materials after they were summarized. Detailed household-level records were often destroyed once aggregate statistics were compiled. The justification was always efficiency. Paper storage was expensive. Data processing required simplification. Summaries were considered sufficient, but critics argued that summaries strip away the most important element of census data, its granularity, because aggregated statistics tell you trends. But raw records tell you stories. They reveal anomalies. They expose outliers. They show patterns that averages can hide. And when those raw records disappear, history becomes smoother, cleaner, more predictable, less complicated, which, in turn, makes official narratives easier to maintain. This pattern becomes especially unsettling when you consider how the role of census data evolved during the late 19th century. Before that era, the census was primarily used for simple population counts. But, starting in 1880, and especially in 1890, it began to serve a much larger purpose. It became a tool for understanding the economic structure of the nation. For the first time, census data was used to map industrial concentration. To analyze wage levels. To track corporate influence over regional economies. To measure the decline of independent agriculture, and to quantify the rise of wage dependency. In other words, the census was beginning to reveal a fundamental shift in American society, a shift from a decentralized economy of independent producers to a centralized system dominated by large institutions, and that transformation was happening rapidly. Between 1870 and 1900, the United States experienced one of the fastest economic restructurings in human history. Railroads expanded across the continent, factories replaced local workshops. Corporate trusts consolidated entire industries. Millions of people moved from rural communities into dense urban environments. And for the first time, vast portions of the population became economically dependent on wages, controlled by centralized employers. The 1890 census captured this transformation at its peak. It was, essentially, a snapshot of the exact moment when the balance of power in American society fundamentally shifted, and then, almost entirely, it disappeared, which leads to a question that continues to quietly haunt historians. If that data had survived fully intact, what patterns might it have revealed? Would it have shown how quickly wealth concentrated during the Gilded Age? Would it have exposed the scale of economic displacement caused by industrial expansion? Would it have documented levels of inequality far higher than official narratives later acknowledged? We can't know, because the evidence is gone. But there is one final detail that makes this story even more unsettling. In modern times, census data is considered so important that it is protected by some of the strictest archival laws in existence. Detailed census records are sealed for 72 years to protect privacy, but they are carefully preserved. Fireproof vaults, multiple backups, digital redundancy systems, because today, governments openly acknowledge that census data is essential to understanding national history, essential to policy decisions. Essential to democratic accountability. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If census records are now treated as invaluable national assets, why were they treated as disposable for so much of the past? Why were the most detailed early records stored in unsafe conditions? Why were repeated warnings ignored? Why were partially damaged records later destroyed by official order? And why does the largest loss, the 1890 census, coincide so precisely with one of the most transformative economic periods in American history? No official investigation ever concluded there was intentional wrongdoing. No definitive proof of deliberate destruction has ever been found. But historians who study archival patterns often point out something quietly unsettling. Sometimes, the most effective way to shape history is not to rewrite it, not to censor it, not to alter it, but simply to let it disappear. Because once records are gone, debates become speculation, evidence becomes theory, and the past becomes easier to reinterpret, which leaves us with a haunting reality. Somewhere in the early 20th century, millions of handwritten pages once existed, pages that recorded the lives, struggles, and economic realities of an entire nation at a turning point in its history, pages that could have answered questions we still ask today about inequality, migration, labor, and power. Pages that could have revealed patterns we may never fully understand, and now, almost all of them are gone. Not lost in ancient times, not destroyed in war, but erased quietly, within living memory, officially labeled as accidents, as routine disposal, as bureaucratic oversight. And yet, when you trace the patterns, when you examine the timeline, when you look at what vanished and what survived, a question lingers in the shadows of history. Was it really just negligence? Or did those records reveal something so inconvenient that forgetting them became necessary? Because sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries aren't about what history shows us, they're about what it no longer can. In 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the U.S. Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. It didn't start dramatically. There was no explosion, no sabotage report, just a quiet electrical spark, somewhere near a storage room no one paid attention to. By the time officials realized what was burning, it was already too late. Inside that room were shelves, row after row of wooden shelves, and on those shelves were the original records of the 1890 United States Census. Not copies, not summaries, the originals, handwritten pages containing the names, addresses, family structures, occupations, illnesses, deaths, disabilities, and personal details of nearly 63 million Americans. Within hours, almost all of it was gone. Officials later described the damage as catastrophic. They said approximately 90% of the records were completely destroyed. But what they didn't explain was something far more unsettling: why those records were stored in the most vulnerable part of the building. Why they had never been properly archived. And why, despite multiple warnings years earlier, no serious effort was made to protect them, because this wasn't the first time census records had been destroyed, not even close. I didn't realize how strange this pattern was until I started researching my own family history. It began as something simple. I wanted to trace my great-great-grandfather, a man who supposedly arrived in America sometime in the late 1800s. According to family stories, he appeared almost out of nowhere. No one knew exactly where he came from. No one knew what he did before he settled. And when I tried to find him in official records, I kept running into the same barrier. The year 1890. Every genealogy database, every historical archive, every professional researcher I spoke with repeated the same phrase: that census was destroyed. At first, it sounded like an unfortunate accident. Fires happen, old paper burns eyes, bureaucracies make mistakes. But the deeper I went, the more I realized something disturbing. It wasn't just the 1890 census. Large portions of earlier census records had also vanished. The 1790 census, incomplete. The 1800 census, massive gaps. The 1810 census, missing sections. Even the 1820 and 1830 records had unexplained losses. Entire regions simply disappeared from official history, and it wasn't random. The missing records followed patterns. Geographic patterns, economic patterns, and, most unsettling of all, social patterns, because when historians compared what remained with what was lost, they noticed something strange. The most detailed data, the records that tracked wealth, labor classifications, property ownership, and industrial employment, were disproportionately destroyed. It was as if someone had carefully erased the economic fingerprints of an entire nation. Official explanations always sounded harmless. Poor storage conditions, clerical negligence, accidental fires, water damage, routine disposal due to lack of space. But the timelines didn't match. In fact, in 1909, 12 years before the famous fire, Congress was warned that the census archives were at risk. A federal report described them as being stored in flammable conditions. Lawmakers were told preservation efforts were urgently needed. Nothing was done. Then, in 1919, just 2 years before the fire, archivists again raised alarms. They specifically warned about the 1890 census records, calling them irreplaceable national assets. Still, nothing changed. No fireproof faults. No relocation. No duplication. And when the fire finally happened in 1921, something else didn't make sense. Only certain sections burned completely. Other materials stored nearby survived with minimal damage. Investigators noted this inconsistency at the time, but the findings were quietly buried in internal reports. What's even stranger is what happened after the fire. Some of the damaged records were not actually destroyed. Thousands of partially burned census pages still existed. They could have been restored. They could have been preserved. But in 1933, more than a decade later, the government officially ordered their destruction, not because they were beyond saving, but because they were labeled obsolete. Obsolete. Historical documents containing the only surviving record of millions of lives destroyed by official order. That's when historians started noticing something even more unsettling. The 1890 census wasn't just another census year. It was unique. Unlike previous censuses, it included an unprecedented level of detail. It recorded not just population counts, but deep socioeconomic data, income levels, employment types, industrial classifications, medical conditions, military service, immigration status, even household debt information. It was, in essence, the most complete snapshot of American society ever taken up to that point. and it was taken at a very specific moment in history, the end of the Reconstruction era, the rise of massive industrial monopolies, the transition from a rural economy to urban wage labor, period when wealth inequality was skyrocketing, when labor strikes were increasing, entire communities were being displaced by industrial expansion. In other words, the 1890 census captured the exact moment when America transformed from a decentralized society into a corporate industrial powerhouse. And then, almost entirely, it vanished. Historians who study economic history often call this period the lost statistical bridge, because without those records, there is a massive data gap between the post-war economy and the early 20th century. We can't precisely track how wealth shifted, we can't fully map migration patterns. We can't accurately measure the scale of industrial labor displacement. It's like trying to understand a movie after someone removed an entire middle act. But here's where the pattern becomes even harder to ignore: that the destruction of census records wasn't limited to fires. In multiple documented cases during the late 1800s and early 1900s, local census records were intentionally destroyed. After being transferred to federal authorities, sometimes they were burned, sometimes they were pulped, sometimes they were simply discarded, and each time, the justification was the same: lack of storage space, which sounds reasonable until you realize what was happening at the same time. During those exact decades, the federal government was aggressively expanding its archival infrastructure. New record facilities were being built, massive storage programs were funded, entire departments were created, specifically to preserve military, financial, and land ownership records. So why were census records treated differently? Why were the most detailed population records repeatedly labeled expendable? Some researchers believe the answer lies in what those records revealed. Because census data didn't just count people, it exposed patterns of power. It showed where wealth was concentrated. It revealed labor exploitation. It documented sudden demographic shifts that official narratives didn't always acknowledge. And most importantly, it provided evidence that could challenge political claims about economic progress, evidence that could contradict corporate narratives about industrial growth, evidence that could reveal systemic inequality. Without those records, many historical debates become impossible to resolve definitively, which raises a